Chapter 6 Shining Stupidity, UFOs and Religion. If Atlantis was built by the same time-traveling breakaway civilization that had initially set itself up on Mars and then rendered the Earth habitable for humans by manufacturing the Moon, a number of deeply disturbing conclusions follow from that, and these also raise more questions about the history of close encounters. Such a scenario would suggest that the time-travelers eventually failed to isolate themselves from the historical continuum of human life on Earth that led to the development of the breakaway civilization. For whatever reason, these people nuked themselves on Mars and they took the biosphere of that planet with them. As we shall see in this chapter, and as was already intimated by the story of Atlantis as both Plato and Steiner recounted it, this suggests that almost from the outset there were two factions in the breakaway civilization, and their ideological conflict with one another was so intense as to eventually explode into a nuclear war. Nor was the nuclear war on Mars the last use of such apocalyptic weapons by these gods and titans. In this present chapter, at least two other examples of the use of nuclear weapons in ancient times will be presented. In any case, Mars in the remote past failed to function as a temporal quarantine zone, and so did Atlantis. While it appears that Antarctica may have initially been chosen as the base of operations for the time travelers because of its relative isolation from other landmasses where the Nordics supposed that their human ancestors will eventually evolve, something seems to have gone wrong along the way, and this relative isolation and non-interference was abandoned in favor of a direct management of human life across the entire planet. This chapter will begin by examining how and why that happened. We will take our lead from Charles Fort, and his radical insights will continue to shape the next and final chapter as well. Writing in New York City in the early years of the 20th century, Ford was the first great researcher of the paranormal in general. His contributions to the fringe field of paranormal studies was so fundamental and foundational that the term Fortean phenomena has come to be synonymous with paranormal phenomena. Among the various types of paranormal phenomena studied by Ford are many aspects of the close encounter phenomenon. The 4 volumes that Ford wrote, based on the painstaking study of the scientific journals and newspaper reports of his era and previous epochs, namely the Book of the Damned, 1919, New Lands, 1923, Low, 1931, and Wild Talents, 1932, are full of UFO reports. Of course, Ford did not use the term UFO or even flying saucer to refer to these artificial constructions in the air and under the water, but that is exactly what he was writing about. More importantly, Ford ventures a handful of revolutionary theses about this phenomenon that predate the speculation of modern UFO researchers by half a century or more. The first 2 of them will be the points of departure for the sections of this chapter, and the next 3 will be elaborated upon in the following and final chapter. These 5 theses also surpassed most serious theorization about close encounters in terms of their level of sophistication, and with a view to humanistic intellectual courage of the theorist who was promising them. Maybe Ford could muster up that kind of courage because he also had a profound black humor and an unfailing wit. The atmosphere of Ford's writings is comparable to that later conjured by Stanley Kubrick in his horrifically hilarious film Dr. Strangelove, 1964. The first thesis of Ford was that humans are the property of the beings that are piloting these crafts through the air and under the oceans. We were bred by them and are herded and sometimes culled like cattle or sheep. The idea will be the point of departure for the first section of this chapter. It will begin with a review of ancient Mesopotamian creation myths as compared to the story of Eden and engineering of mankind in the Bible. A speculation is ventured that before this creation of a race of human slaves, an unsuccessful attempt had been made to design semi-intelligent slaves based on the genome of dinosaurs. It will be argued that this is what yielded the so-called reptilians of the close encounter phenomenon, who are more escapees of a primordial Frankenstein's laboratory than they are aliens. Then, empirical evidence for the genetic engineering of humanity will be assessed, along with the controversial data regarding race differences in intelligence and emotional qualities in populations that are more versus less hybridized with the Nordic master race that created most humans to be part of slave races. The plural is employed here because it appears that these engineers also organized various degrees of subhuman hominids and more human-like races that they designed into a hierarchically stratified caste system, a system which was preserved most faithfully by Hindus in India. In other words, the Anunnaki or Elohim, the gods of Eden, are the Devas of Indo-European Aryan tradition. Even from the start, there was a conflict within this group, between the Devas proper and the gods and a group of rebels. It was actually one amongst this group of Asuras or Titans who genetically engineered humanity, albeit initially in cooperation with the gods. This figure, known to the ancient Mesopotamians as Enki and to the Greeks as Prometheus, is the dragon who tempts Eve with knowledge and immortality in Eden. He becomes the Satan, that is, adversary of Abrahamic revelation, when he leads a fully scaled titanic, that is, demonic, revolt against the other gods, angels, mainly in protest over their tyrannical enslavement of human beings and their treatment of people who were really his own children, as if they were herd animals or beasts of burden. In the Bible and its Apocrypha, this takes the form of the story of the fallen angels, who, among other means of resistance, interbreed with certain mortal women to raise the stock of humans by further hybridizing them with their godly progenitors. The civilization of hybrids that ensued from this, namely Atlantis, is punished by the gods, the Elohim, who use a great flood to wipe it off the face of the earth. We will look at the wars between the gods and the Titans, especially in the form that it takes in Hindu epics. In the Sanskrit scriptures of India, we see that the Devas and the Asuras are described in terms that unmistakably identify them as the pilots of UFOs in the context of modern close encounters. Sometimes they even deploy nuclear weapons from their Vimanas, destroying cities populated by humans in much the same way as Sodom and Gomorrah are nuked by the chief of Elohim in the Bible. The second thesis of Ford was that UFO pilots are the angels and demons referred to in the Bible and other ancient religious scriptures of mankind. In other words, they have been worshipped as our gods, and these gods are tyrannical, celestial Temolens who have been responsible for the most brutal wars on this planet. This Fortean insight will be the basis for the second section of this chapter. From the Tower of Babel, through founding of Israel by Moses and Joshua, up to the close encounters and abductions of Ezekiel, the revelations, foundational to the Abrahamic religions, all come from out of UFOs. That is what a close analysis of scripture demonstrates. When it is read in light of even basic knowledge about the phenomenology of close encounters. This second section will quote directly from chapter and verse of the Bible, and not from second sources comparing biblical incidents to close encounters. That having been said, there are two books about UFOs and the Bible that are especially noteworthy, and to which credit is owed for suggesting that these passages of scripture ought to be interpreted with UFOs in mind. The first is UFO and the Bible by Maurice K. Jessup, originally published in 1956. The second is The Bible and Flying Saucers, published in 1968 by Barry H. Downey. The problem with both books is that their authors do not examine the close encounters that produce the revelations of the biblical prophets in a way that considers the content of the messages from an ethical standpoint. This results in a bizarre, almost pathological acceptance of the fact that the Bible was revealed by UFO pilots who have massively intervened in human history, together with an acceptance of these interventions as divine or godly. Neither Jessup nor Downing consider the absolutely appalling stupidity, inhuman cruelty, genocidal brutality, and wicked psychological manipulation that can clearly be discerned in these revelations if they are examined in detail, as they are examined in this study, again with reference to chapter and verse of the Bible. In section 3, we see that Jesus Christ is no exception to this, either as Gnostics who oppose Yahweh would love him to be. The text of the New Testament itself, and also testament from government sources in the know about the antiquity of close encounters, both converge on the conclusion that Jesus Christ was a product of the UFO phenomenon. As will be argued toward the end of the section, the purpose of the messianic mission and schizophrenically pathological message of Jesus Christ was to afflict the classical mind with a crippling cognitive dissonance. That is also true of Prophet Muhammad, whose wars of conquest and forcible conversion were mandated by the same class of beings manipulating contemporary contactees and abductees. This manipulation not only caused the medieval Dark Age, it continued through it, with the Black Plague having been a biowarfare attempt to delay the revitalization of culture that eventually did manifest as the Renaissance. We will look at this in the fourth section of this chapter, beginning with an assessment of how much catastrophic damage was done to the scientific and technical culture of Alexandrian Rome by the UFO revelation, and of course that is Judeo-Christianity. The Renaissance was only possible because a battle was hard fought behind the scenes of our history, but also dramatically in the skies over European cities, between factions that are either for or against human progress and self-determination. Striking Renaissance-era newspaper accounts and woodcut images preserve the memory of these incidents of UFOs battling openly in the skies over Germany and Switzerland. Finally, what is most appalling is that a comparative study of near-death experiences, NDEs, and close encounters of the fourth kind strongly suggests that the control system set up by these beings extends into the afterlife, and employs a psychotronic technology that can manipulate human souls as energetic and informational structures. This will be the subject of the fifth and final section of this chapter. We are manipulated after death and made to forget our past lives, just as abductees are made to forget their abductions until they undergo regression hypnosis. Resistance is not futile, though. A potential spectral revolution in the sciences could afford us our own psychotronic technology, which together with other Promethean transhumans technologies could allow us to eat off the tree of life that was denied to us in Eden. 6.1 The Slavers of Eden. Descriptions of what we now call UFOs fill the chronicles drawn together by Charles Fort from so many scientific journals and newspapers of the late 19th century and early 20th century. He calls them super constructions and ships from other worlds that have been seen by millions of inhabitants on this earth night after night. Close quotes. Ford even describes details such as the characteristic falling leaf motion of a flying saucer that moves as if it is falling like a plate through water. More than a decade before Kenneth Arnold introduced this image to the public consciousness in 1947 with his description of the discs that were flying over Mount Rainier near his own airplane. Ford also describes the cigar-shaped or cylindrical UFOs. Some of these craft are monstrous in size. For example, one of them about the size of Brooklyn, offhand, underquotes. Ford continues, and one or more of them will shaped things a goodly number of square miles in the area, close quotes. Or this evocative description of another gigantic UFO, reminiscent of the scale of certain of the craft seen in the night skies over Belgium in 1989. The vast dark thing that looked like a poised crow of unholy dimensions, underquotes. That line is from the Book of the Damned, published in 1919. It is in Ford's writing that we meet with the first extensive discussion of the mystery airship wave of 1896 to 97. That was presented in Chapter 3 of this study, wherein Jules Verne-style electrogravity craft were seen flying over and landing in Kansas, Chicago, Omaha, Texas, and other states. But what is most interesting is Ford's response to a rather stupid question that others only started asking with regard to UFOs decades later. Namely, why don't they just openly make contact with us? Even in Ford's time, there were claims concerning ET contact. For example, the sensational news story that Nikola Tesla had received radio signals from Mars. In this context, Ford goes on the record that he does not think that the beings piloting the super constructions in the sky are attempting to communicate with this world. Ford is so avant-garde in his thinking on this question that in 1919 he already considers the prime directive that Star Trek would introduce into the debate over this question in the late 1960s. But he ultimately dismisses the idea that the beings are staying away out of a sense of moral obligation to protect us from the deleterious interferences in our development. Often enough, the evidence of engagement that we do have suggests that these beings are degraded, rather than moral. Referring to a celestial city called Cycloria, one of the many made-up names for what Jacques Vallée called Magonia, based on medieval close encounter reports, Ford, with his characteristic wit and ironical sarcasm, rhetorically poses the question: Why not diplomatic relations established between the United States and Cycloria, which in our advanced astronomy is the name of a remarkable wheel-shaped world or superconstruction? Why not missionaries sent here openly to convert us from our barbarous prohibitions and other taboos, and to prepare the way for a good trade in ultra-Bibles and super whiskies? Ford answers his own question in terrifying terms, explaining that they should no less be expected to make contact with us any more than we should be expected to engage in diplomacy with the chattel animals that we breed on farms and butcher in slaughterhouses. We are owned, cultivated and called by them. Would we, if we would educate and sophisticate pigs, geese and cattle? Would it be wise to establish diplomatic relations with the hen that now functions, satisfied with the mere sense of achievement by the way of compensation? I think we're property. I should say we belong to something. That something owns this earth. All others are warned off. Ford goes on to suggest that a select few from amongst our population, who we mistake as an occulted elite, operating through secret societies, have always acted as managerial overseers of the untouchable, the rabble that we are, on behalf of the true administrators of the colonial empire that claims sovereign jurisdiction over this planet. The overseers in a concentration camp or the wardens in a prison would only seem like an elite, to inmates who had never known or even heard about life outside its walls. Ford draws an analogy to the British Raj system in India. We think of India, the millions of natives who are ruled by a small band of esoterics only because they receive support and direction from somewhere else or from England. This is exactly the kind of situation that we find when we look at the most ancient texts about mankind's relationship with the creator gods. These are the Sumerian texts of ancient Mesopotamia, which in some cases were preserved through Akkadian and Babylonian translations. According to these creation myths of Sumer, the Anunnaki, or those who from heaven to earth came, were the creators and gods of mankind. That the Sumerians say the Anunnaki refer to them as black-headed people, suggests that these gods, themselves were fair-haired. When they first settled on this planet, the Anunnaki had to endure back-breaking labor to make it a place fit for their habitation. Mining and engineering, construction, agriculture and metallurgy were all forms of hard labor that they initially performed themselves. At a certain point, facing repeated revolts from their own ranks by those tasked with the hardest labor, they tired of this and decided to use their advanced technology, included in the area of genetics, to design a race of beings subordinate to themselves, and to whom the Anunnaki would be gods, and masters. Before continuing with this summary of the Sumerian account of the creation of mankind as a slave race, it is worth noting that it has parallels in the ancient texts and oral traditions of other cultures. Some of these parallels are particularly illuminating and offer us missing pieces of the puzzle. For example, in the Mayan Popol Vuh, we have an account that runs parallel to much of the Sumerian history, but adds the very important fact that the gods initially wanted to create a race of slaves that would not be human like themselves. It makes sense, at least from an ethical standpoint, that they would at first try to avoid enslaving very human-like beings, and would instead start by hybrid androids or biological robots that were different enough from humans that it would somewhat assuage their consciences. What shape would the first of their Frankensteinian monsters have taken? If, as chapter 4 and 5 argued, the time-traveling master race built the moon around 250 million years before the present and were responsible for the Permian extinction event, then they would also have been responsible for the evolution of the dinosaurs. Perhaps this would have given the Anunnaki a sense that they had right to harvest genetic material from a type of dinosaur promising enough to be hybridized with human genes in a way that produced a race of workers. It is quite clear which dinosaur this would have been. The Canadian paleontologist and geologist Dale Russell named it Stenonychosaurus when he discovered it in 1970s, but the species has since been renamed Troodon. The Troodon's encephalization quotient, EQ, or the ratio of the weight of its brain to that of related species with the same body weight, is 6 times that of any other dinosaur. Unlike other dinosaurs, the man-sized raptor also had binocular vision and an opposable thumb. Troodon lived 75 million years ago and appeared to be a pack hunter that preyed upon the earliest mammals. Russell theorized that had the KT extinction event not taken place, these features would have allowed the Troodon to develop technology and evolve into a dinosauroid, who might have supplanted man by hunting our mammal predecessors. In 1982, Russell worked with Ron Sanguine to develop an anatomically compelling model of this hypothetical intelligent, upright dinosauroid. This creepy thing looks eerily similar to the descriptions offered by abductees who have had the misfortune of interacting with so-called reptilians. Could it be that the reptilians are so brutal with those whom they abduct, often raping human women, because those of them who have survived somewhere, perhaps deep underground, harbor a profound resentment for having been created by humans of the time-traveling Nordic master race as a slave race? Why assume that the reptilians are aliens? There are some traces in the Sumerian text to suggest that before deciding that a being as close as possible to the Anunnaki would make for the most viable slave, the gods ran a veritable Frankenstein's laboratory, experimenting with various types of hybrid beings that they could subordinate as forced labors. These rejects, some of whom could have survived in the wild or gone underground en masse, could actually account for a variety of cryptids other than putatively alien reptilians. Many of them could be failed attempts at engineering a less human slave race, before the Anunnaki finally decided that only something modeled very closely on themselves would work. In the project of engineering mankind, there was a conflict of interest between two Anunnaki leaders, Enki and Enlil, who were half-brothers and sons of the celestial father Anu, root of the word Anunnaki. Enki was actually the former's title. His name was Ea. It means the Lord of the Earth. He was born off-world, somewhere in the heavens, before the Anunnaki settled on Earth. The Sumerians tell us that Ea was the older of the two rival brothers, but somehow he lost his original dominion over the Earth, which is still reflected in his title Enki, to his young half-brother Enlil. Instead, Enki's dominion was restricted to the oceans and sea. This is a parallel to the myth of the rivalry of Poseidon and Zeus. Enki was a master of craft, and he was famous for having drained the swamplands around the Persian Gulf using ingenious technology, as well as for building vessels to navigate the seas and oceans that were his domain. He was also a genetic engineer and was tasked with the creation of the new race, except that with his visionary spirit, he had more in mind for his creations than that they merely become slaves. Enki champions their cause at councils of Anunnaki, but is overruled by Enlil, a tyrant who sways the others to accept his view that the slave race should be treated harshly and cruelly, as if they were things rather than people. Here we see a clear parallel of the conflict between Prometheus and Zeus over the fate of mankind. That parallel continues when we look at what the Sumerian texts tell us eventually happened with the slave race. Supposedly they proliferated in large numbers and, instead of serving the Anunnaki obediently, became a headache for them. So Enlil decided to send various pestilences, droughts and famines to cut men down. When this proved insufficient, he and those Anunnaki who accepted his leadership decided on a great deluge as a means to decimate mankind, or at least humble men back into servitude. Enki breaks ranks with the Anunnaki to warn mankind of this coming flood through Utnapishtim, who is tasked with preparing an ark to preserve various animals, craft and types of knowledge that will allow human civilization to continue after the flood waters subside. This presents a parallel to the story of Prometheus tasking his son Deucalion with safeguarding human civilization throughout the deluge and rebuilding it following the flood. In the biblical version of the story, which is written from the perspective of Enlil, namely Yahweh, the tyrant self-servingly twists the story to make it as if he was the one who chose a human, namely Noah, to preserve civilization after the flood. As will be seen below, this rewriting actually does not make sense and is internally contradictory, because Yahweh, or Enlil, very clearly claims to regret, that he made mankind at all, and his typically tempestuous initial intention is to wipe humanity out, at least as any kind of remotely civilized species. Someone else saved civilized humanity, the figure that Sumerians called Enki, that Greeks knew as Prometheus, and that in the Bible is branded as the Satan, or adversary of Yahweh. The first thing that we will notice by carefully attending to the text of the Tanakh or Old Testament, rather than the history of subsequent interpretations that have overlaid and occluded it, is that the so-called God of this scripture is not a single omnipotent and omniscient deity. Two Hebrew words are predominantly used for God in the Bible, Elohim and Edonai. The latter, Adonai, is a title. It simply means Lord, as in a feudal lord or chieftain. The Hebrew word Elohim is the plural of El, and its translation as God in the Old Testament is terribly misleading. It actually means the gods or the divine beings. The word Elohim is derived from Elu, which means the shining, underquotes. So the gods of the Old Testament are literally the shining ones, underquotes. Interestingly, this is exactly the same descriptor that the Hindus use to refer to the gods of their pantheon. They are called Devas, and the Sanskrit words Deva, God, or Devi, goddess, also mean shining one. There are numerous passages throughout the Old Testament where it becomes clear that the Lord or Adonai of the Israelites is simply the chieftain of a band of gods, comparable to Zeus as the leader of the Olympian pantheon of the Greeks or Indra in the Vedic religion. The earliest and most important of these passages are in the book of Genesis. They concern the humanoid form of the Elohim and the godlike potential of mankind. In Genesis 1:26-27, we read, "And Elohim said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And Elohim created man in their image. In the image of Elohim, he, Adonai, created him. Male and female, he, Adonai, created them." Most translations obscure the distinction between the Creator, who is the Lord of the Elohim or the gods, and the gods and goddesses in whose image men and women were created, by translating Elohim as God, singular, whereas it is literally plural in the text, and by conflating this God with he, which refers to the Lord, Adonai, or chieftain of the Elohim. In fact, the phrase chief of the gods or Adonai Elohim, which is improperly translated the Lord God, appears repeatedly in the Torah. The implication of the statement that mankind was wrought in the image of the Elohim is that we have the potential to be gods. In fact, the second passage in Genesis, where it is very clear that we are dealing not with an all-knowing or all-powerful God, but with gods who are ruled by a single sovereign, has to do with the first step taken by man, or rather by a woman, to realize this godlike potential. In Genesis 3:4-6, the serpent explains to Eve that the Lord of the Elohim lied when he told her and Adam that eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge and the tree of life in the middle of the garden, or even touching them, would result in death. Rather, "You are not going to die," the serpent explains. "But God knows that as soon as you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like divine beings, Elohim, who know good and evil." Once they have eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve make loincloths for themselves to hide their nakedness. Now, this is not on account of prudishness. When we are told in Genesis 2:25 that the two of them were naked, yet they felt no shame, underquotes, we have to remember that in the culture and epoch to which this scripture belongs, nakedness was a sign of slavery. Slave laborers went about naked. Humans were created because there was no man to till the soil, underquotes, in the garden of the gods at Eden. Genesis 2:5. When the newly enlightened couple hears the sound of the Lord approaching, they hide themselves. Once again, it is clear that God is a man, one walking about in Eden, who might not notice the couple hiding in the bushes. "They heard the sound of the Lord God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day, and the man and his wife hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. The Lord God called out to the man and said to him, 'Where are you?' He replied, 'I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid.' Then he asked, 'Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat of the tree from which I had forbidden you to eat?'" The Lord's reaction to this supposed transgression of seeking knowledge and defying enforced ignorance is also very revealing of the all-too-human character and motivations of the Elohim. Genesis 3:15-19. The serpent is cursed for enlightening man. Its legs are taken away so that it has to crawl in the dust of the earth. And this suggests that before being punished in this manner, it was a dragon, a suggestion that will be confirmed in the New Testament, Revelation 12:8, when Satan is referred to as the great dragon, that old serpent, underquotes. Eve or womankind is punished with pain in childbearing and subservience to men, to fathers, husbands, and brothers. Men are sentenced to hard labor, quite literally to working themselves to death. Most revealing, however, are these lines from Genesis 3:22-24. "And the chief Elohim, or the leader of the gods, said, 'Now that the man has become like one of us, knowing good and bad, what if he should stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever?' So the leader of the gods banished him from the Garden of Eden to till the soil from which he was taken. He drove the man out and stationed east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and the fiery, ever-turning sword to guard the way to the tree of life." Undercourse. This God is jealous and fearful that the men who have been created in the image of the gods that he rules might actually live up to their godlike potential. In other words, that they might become his equal. The cherubim are angelic beams that, together with some blazing sword-like device, akin to a double-bladed lightsaber, guard the tree of life, are there to prevent human beings from attaining the immortality of the gods, in addition to the godlike ability to know or discern things, such as good and evil, from one another. The latter would, of course, be indispensable to recognizing evil, undergoes, for what it is, or realizing that evil was being done to you, including by your putative guardians. Is there any empirical evidence that we were genetically engineered by these gods of Eden? Yes, there is actually quite a bit of evidence for that. The more advanced that our own genetic science and technology have become, with recent inventions such as CRISPR, the more easily scientists are able to detect indications of the use of comparable technology to produce the evolutionary leap that differentiated humans from ape-like early hominids. HAR1 is a genetic coding sequence that is part of highly conserved DNA, which remains stable over tens of millions of years. This is the part of our genome that used to be referred to as junk DNA, undercourse. The mutational difference between a chicken and a chimpanzee is in the HRA1 sequence of 118 letters consists of only 2 letters, whereas the difference between chimpanzees and humans in the same sequence is 18 letters. HAR1 plays a key role in the development of the cerebral cortex. Before this sudden 18-letter mutation, which differentiated humans from their common ancestors with chimpanzees, the average rate of mutation of HAR1 was 1 letter in the genetic sequence every 150 million years. How then was it possible for 18 letters to change in about 6 million years? Geneticists do not know. Dr. Kathleen Pollard of the Gladstone Institute, whose expertise in statistical and computational analysis of genomics, says, "Statistically speaking, the probability that a highly conserved DNA sequence will change multiple times over 6 million years of evolution is close to 0. HAR1 is only one of several hundred examples of this kind which have been recently discovered due to breakthroughs in biotechnology. More than half of these appear to involve genes that code for development of the human brain. One of the most intriguing is ARSGAP11B. According to Marta Florio, a molecular and cellular biologist at the Max Planck Institute, this gene, as it appears in humans, has been spliced from out of a longer genetic sequence, duplicated and then reinserted into a genome. Only the recent development of CRISPR gene editing technology has made it possible for geneticists to recognize the signature of something like this having been done. We share this apparent genetic modification with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Another example is the MIR941, a gene that emerged from out of non-coding sequences, also known as junk DNA, about 780,000 years ago to give us and Neanderthals and Denisovans much of our distinctly human decision-making and language-enabling abilities. Martin Taylor of the University of Edinburgh, who was on the team that discovered this gene and its function, confesses that this gene sprang from nowhere at a time when our species was undergoing dramatic changes." Close quotes. Unfortunately, we have no samples of human DNA that are older than 430,000 years before the present. If we did, geneticists could probably identify exactly when and in what order these changes were made. Perhaps samples cryogenically preserved in the ice sheet of Antarctica will someday afford us an opportunity to do so. Nevertheless, a ballpark estimate of the date for some of these extraordinary changes to our genome has been arrived at by certain geneticists. That figure is somewhere between 750,000 to 780,000 years before the present. At that point, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other branches of Homo all diverged together from more primitive ape-like hominids through a sudden modification of a number of key genetic coding sequences. It is at that time that we see a rapid acceleration in the increase of human brain size, which prior to this time, brain size increased only in proportion to body size. The single most compelling piece of evidence for this is the fusion of chromosome 2 in the human genome. All primates have 48 chromosomes structured as 24 associated pairs, except for modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, who have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Scientists do not understand how two chromosomes fused in order to differentiate us and our closest hominin relatives from earlier primate ancestors and other contemporary primates. Geneticists can clearly see that in the middle of chromosome 2, there is evidence for a fusion wherein genes from the ancestral chromosomes 2A and 2B were lost. The problem is that generally, in evolutionary biology, chromosomal fusion is a mutation that leads to infertility and miscarriage of a fetus with this mutation. In other words, it is a severe genetic defect. But in the case of humans, this chromosomal fusion seems to have played a key role in differentiating us from apes, with the specific genes affected being those associated with cerebral development, the gonads, and other tissues and organs that set us apart from primates. This also somehow took place while retaining the fertility of the population with the mutation, underquotes. A concurrent mutation has actually been identified as having given us precisely the genes needed to prevent spontaneous miscarriage of fetuses with the fused chromosomes. Even more interestingly, evolutionary biologists who have studied this problem theorize that the population in which this change took place was initially highly isolated from the rest of hominins on the planet. That certainly calls to mind the Garden of Eden. One of the most disturbing aspects of this genetic engineering is that it does not appear to have been aimed at the production of a single human type. Rather, since we share many of these anomalously complex and rapid mutations together with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and possibly other hominins not yet studied on a genetic level, the genetic engineers seem to have wanted to create multiple races that would be significantly differentiated from one another. This brings us to a very politically incorrect and sensitive subject matter, namely the question of race. In the last decades of the 20th century, a politically motivated attempt was made to deconstruct the concept of race. At the same time, those advocating for its deconstruction in biology and anthropology often hypocritically espoused a political ideology of social justice based on racial categorizations. Advances in genetic science and the study of new discoveries of remains of Neanderthals and Denisovans with a view to comparative population-level genomics has undermined this attempt. In fact, although the political motivation remains in place to deny this conclusion, evolutionary biology and genetics has now effectively validated the concept of significant racial differences among humans. Denisovans, Neanderthals, and Cro-magnons had significantly different morphological and cognitive or psychological characteristics, including in their capacities and capabilities as determined by genetic variance on a subspecies level. No one would argue that all canines are equal because they belong to the same species. We know that there are huge differences in intelligence and other abilities at the subspecies level when comparing wolves, greyhounds, poodles, and pugs. Minuscule percentages of genetic variance account for those significant differences. Remember that only 4% variance separates the genome of a human from that of a chimpanzee. Only an idiot would think that if someone needs a Labrador Retriever as a hunting dog, it is all the same if he accepts a bulldog for that purpose. If one objects to the analogy on the basis of the claim that dogs were bred to be different from one another, one could point to subspecies differences amongst naturally evolved birds. But one ought to also answer this objection with the claim, defended above, that humans were also bred by the gods on the course of Eden. Apparently, we were bred by them to be differentiated on a subspecies level, just as there are purebred dogs and hybrid dogs. The same thing is the case for humans. By no means is the recognition of this grim historical fact an endorsement of it. Quite to the contrary. Nevertheless, we know that our Cro-magnon ancestors, who account for the majority of the genome of Homo sapiens sapiens, interbred both with Neanderthals and with Denisovans, but different, geographically separated groups of Cro-magnons interbred with one or the other of them, and some Cro-magnons did not interbreed with either. Race, is a concept that accurately describes the differentiation in human population based on whether there is a significant contribution to the genetic code of that ethnic group from one or another non-Cro-magnon subspecies of Homo. In other words, it is a sub-subspecies concept and is as valid as differentiation of various types of hybrid dogs from purebreds and from one another. Furthermore, human racial differences matter a great deal in determining the developmental potential of societies. When considered on a population-wide level, in terms of statistical averages, which is the level at which the characters of societies are formed, there is empirical evidence for vast differences in intelligence, inquisitiveness, industriousness, and creativity among various human racial groups. These differences are not limited to IQ. Where, for example, Nordic whites and East Asians are separated from native black Africans by at least 30 IQ points, with a corresponding difference in levels of economic developments of countries with these respective demographics. It is also expressed in the domains of innovation and creativity, where East Asians fall short as compared to Nordics and other Europeans, or relatively purebred Indo-Europeans, by an equally significant degree despite their comparably high IQ. The scientific genius and technological innovation unique to European, and in some cases Indo-European cultures, is connected to the inquisitiveness and quest for wonder that also inspired the incomparable artistic and literary achievement of Europe, and for a while also of the Aryan people of Iran and northern India, as compared to the rest of Asia. Again, this is likely due to slight genetic variance in divergent degrees of inheritance from extinct subspecies of Homo, such as Neanderthals and Denisovans. The ancestors of some Europeans are purebred Cro-magnons, that is, people of a classically Nordic morphology and phenotype. The ancestors of other Europeans have interbred with Neanderthals, as have the progenitors of some Asians. None have interbred with Denisovans. By contrast, the ancestors of native Africans bred extensively with Denisovans, but not at all with Neanderthals. The progenitors of East Asians may also have interbred with an as of yet genetically unidentified extinct Homo subspecies that were not present in Europe and the Middle East, such as, although not necessarily, Java man, Homo floresiensis. Finally, as will be suggested below, certain Cro-magnons may have interbred with an as of yet genetically unanalyzed but paleontologically discovered race of man from the future with superior intelligence and capabilities. All of this is by way of saying that it appears that the gods of Eden set up a racially stratified caste system as part of their genetic engineering, not a slave race, but of slave races in plural. That is, in fact, exactly what the Sanskrit scriptures of India and Hindu tradition in general tell us about the intentions of the Devas. Hindus believe that the Varna, as in varnish, or color coding system of castes allowed for the gods to have more regular contact with their human subjects in the past, before the degradation of the systems throughout the course of the successive yugas, culminating in the darkest and the most degenerate of old ages, defined by egalitarian and democratic ideas. The Vedic worldview was that of a cosmic hierarchy, or a hierarchical universal government, It should be noted, if only in passing, that this is the view explicitly adopted by Savitri Devi and her followers, thereby establishing a direct connection between the Hindu caste system and its underlying cosmology of yugas on the one hand, and modern eugenics and racial theories on the other. Born Maximiani Portas in 1905 in Lyons, France, to an English mother and a Greek father, Savitri Devi, as she should come to call herself, converted to Hinduism, moved to India, and created a traditionalist cult around the idea that Adolf Hitler was an incarnation of Vishnu. She wrote a number of books promoting this idea, most notably The Lightning and the Sun, texts which, together with writings of Miguel Serrano, became the basis for a neo-Nazi esoteric Hitlerism. Agreeing to Savitri Devi, in this final and darkest age of the Hindu cycle of time, the Kali Yuga, there are three types of men. The first is the man in time, who ruthlessly epitomizes the degenerate forces of the age and is a vehicle for them. She considers Genghis Khan, who to her mind had no real ideology or higher aspiration, as a perfect example of such a man. The symbol of the man in time, is lightning. The second is the man above time, who would have been a Brahmin in the Satya Yuga, the golden age of truth, but whose perfection and purity relegates him to bare survival as a pacifistic and hermetic ascetic in our old age. In Devi's view, both Gautama Buddha and Jesus Christ were such men. Interestingly, she claims that Akhenaten was also such a man above time, undergoes, without the capacity to understand that his solar theology belonged to the bygone golden age, and that an attempt to reinstitute it peacefully in our epoch would end in disaster and martyrdom. The symbol of the man above time, undergoes, is the sun. Finally, there is the man against time, undergoes, who is as ruthlessly violent and has as much of a conquering spirit as the first type, but also uses this force with the wisdom of the second type and with a sincere intention to hasten the end of both end of the dark age and the advent of a new golden age. This type is symbolized by both the lightning and the sun, and in Savitri Devi's view, Adolf Hitler epitomizes this type for a number of reasons. His demand for German national unity in a strong new Reich in defiance of the humiliating Versailles Treaty clearly identified him as a champion of the old tribal principle against the degenerate capitalist and cosmopolitan world of the Allies. His adoption of racist ideas, his anti-Semitism, and the Nuremberg race laws forbidding intermarriage and sexual relations between Aryans and Jews convinced Savitri Devi that he intended the revival of the Aryan caste system on a global basis. She saw his love of children and animals, his domestic modesty, vegetarianism, and abstention from alcohol as typical traits of the kindly ascetic. His ruthless use of military violence against his enemies in a resistant fallen world identified him as the essential man against time. Whether or not Adolf Hitler himself actually, undergoes, intended the revival of the Aryan caste system on a global basis, close quotes, or whether that was more the aim of Himmler and other adepts steeped in the Sanskrit tradition who were in the Reich's leadership with him, is beside the point. What Savitri Devi is valorizing and associating with Hitler as a man against time is a system where at the top of a socio-political pyramid, as a capstone of a caste structure that extended downwards through the Brahmin or priestly caste, the Kshatriyas or knightly caste, down to the Vaishya caste of merchants and farmers, and the Shudra caste of hard-working manual laborers, finally ending in the Chandala or untouchable and putatively subhuman scum, undercourse, at the bottom of the system. Orthodox Hindus think that the undermining of the system over time led to decreased contact between humans of the upper two castes and the higher beings, undercourse, such as the Devas, who want to make sure that there is a social pyramid for their Vimanas to land on, as it were, so that they are at more than an arm's length from the dregs of humanity. This view is based on the fact that Sanskrit scriptures are full of accounts of ancient close encounters between Brahmins or Kshatriyas and Devas riding in Vimana aircraft. These Devas awed mere humans by regularly demonstrating their siddhis or occult superpowers such as telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, clairaudience, psychokinesis, levitation, teleportation, both of themselves and of objects, travel through solid objects while embodied astral projection, invisibility, shape-shifting, long-distance telepathic control of others, and possession of the bodies of others. Their lifespans are vastly greater than that of humans. Although Sanskrit texts also claim that in remote antiquity, humans had significantly longer lifespans as well. Despite living for so much longer than humans, they will also die and have to reincarnate. This is another major reason for their having established the caste system. Empirical study of hundreds of cases of people with past life recollection by researchers such as the late Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia suggests that when it comes to reincarnation, out of sight is out of mind. People tend not to reincarnate in geographical places that are unfamiliar to them, or amongst people with whom they have had no connection during their lives. Establishing a huge chasm between themselves and lower castes would ensure that Devas are never reborn under such miserable conditions. They were, however, known to sometimes be reincarnated as Brahmins or Kshatriyas, one prominent case of the latter being Gautama Shakyamuni himself. The Buddha claimed to remember having been a Deva in the life immediately preceding his rebirth as Gautama, and he had numerous interactions with Devas while preaching as Buddha. Devas were also believed to have sometimes had love affairs with upper caste humans and interbred with them, producing demigod hybrids. Sanskrit texts clearly describe the Devas as organized in a military hierarchy, and they engage in politics and warfare, with their battles with lower forces, often having an impact on life on Earth. Their battle chariots are flying machines known as Vimana, craft which are indistinguishable from contemporary UFOs in terms of their described performance capabilities. We know this because there are entire shastras in Sanskrit devoted to the description of Vimanas and their operation, as best as ancient Hindus could reconstruct that from their direct observations. Since contemporary scientists claim not to understand physics and engineering of UFOs, it is only fair that ancient Hindus be caught some slack in their speculations. There are even accounts of nuclear weapons having been used by the Devas, as in the passage from Mahabharata. It was as if the elements had been unleashed. The sun spun around, scorched by the incandescent heat of the weapon. The world reeled in fever. Elephants were set on fire by the heat and ran to and fro in a frenzy to seek protection from the terrible violence. The water boiled. The animals died. The enemy was mown down, and the raging of the blaze made the trees collapse in rows as in a forest fire. The elephants made a fearful trumpeting and sank dead to the ground over a vast area. Horses and war chariots were burned up, and the scene looked like the aftermath of a conflagration. Thousands of chariots were destroyed. Then deep silence descended on the sea. The winds began to blow, and the earth grew bright. It was a terrible sight to see. The corpses of the fallen were mutilated by terrible heat, so that they no longer looked like human beings. Never before have we seen such a ghastly weapon, and never before have we heard of such a weapon. The text goes on to describe how the survivors threw themselves into the water to wash off the radioactive fallout, but that many of them fell ill regardless, and their hair and nails fell out, and after a few hours all the foodstuffs were infected. This celestial weapon, that caused the explosion was shaped like a harpoon, in other words, a missile. No less a scientific mind than J. Robert Oppenheimer found this compelling. Oppenheimer, one of the inventors of the American atomic bomb, thought that when taken together with ancient vitrified desert plants and tektites, passages such as these from the Sanskrit scriptures were evidence for nuclear wars in antiquity. The vastly ancient ruins of the cities of Mohenjo Daro and Harappa in the Indian subcontinent are actually more vitrified than any other sites that have hitherto been discovered. The molecular structure of their walls and foundations have been fused, as is also found at nuclear test sites. The majority of the battles of the Devas are with a group from among their own ranks who rebelled against the hierarchical divine order of the cosmos. These are called the Asuras or Titans. Not incidentally, Zarathustra valorizes one of these Asuras as the Lord of Wisdom and pits him against the whole host of Devas who he demonizes. In other words, he inverts the Aryan pantheon, and the terms in which he describes Manjai Ahura or the wise Titan are almost identical to the defining qualities of the Titan Prometheus, especially his forethought, Greek Promethea, Avestan Spenda Manu, and his association with fire, his encouragement of civilization and cultivation, and his call for humans to rise up in rebellion against the tyrannical, manipulative, and deceptive gods. But from the Orthodox Hindu and Vedic perspective, the Asuras are the demons, beings who oppose the divine order, and are atheistic, in the sense of rejecting the idea of Brahman or the existence of a supreme being, who sanctifies this putatively divine order, including the evaluation of karma and its institutionalization in the caste system. The plot of the Sanskrit epic Mahabharata is woven around an account of an invasion, of the earth by Asuras who attacked Deva cities from huge Vimanas. Although from the perspective of the Titans, this was probably considered an attempt to liberate humans from their Deva overlords. Interestingly, the Bhagavad Purana describes how the Buddha of an earlier age, preceding Gautama Buddha, was sent in order to mollify the Asuras with his mesmerizing teaching so that they would abandon their war on the Devas and their rebellion against the whole divine order. When the atheists, after being well versed in the Vedic scientific knowledge, annihilate the inhabitants of the different planets, flying unseen in the sky on well-built Vimanas prepared by the great scientist Maya, the Lord will bewilder their minds by dressing himself attractively as Buddha and will preach on sub-religious principles. This is a fascinating Vedic critique of Buddhism. It frames the Buddhas as avatars of Vedic supreme being who disguises himself as a Buddha to preach pacifist and nihilist teachings that are really intended to lull the Asuras into abandoning their struggle against the Devas. In other words, Buddhist teachings are designed to spiritually weaken atheistic people with a titanic mentality who would otherwise oppose the divine order on the gods and lull them into a least tacit acceptance of the Devic status quo. Even if this very claim regarding Buddhism is not true with respect to the intention of the Buddhas, it is true with a view to the unintended consequence of the nihilistic and pacifistic teachings of a sage such as Gautama. The best that can be said about the Buddha Dharma, which I have written about extensively elsewhere, is that it rejects the putative religious revelations and course from the Devas as deceptive manipulations. But by claiming that the Asuras are also deluded, and that anyone who uses violence to resist the Devas and their tyrannical system is an egotist straying from the path to enlightenment and is sowing bad karma, Gautama and other Buddhas before him were basically calling for us to throw in the towel. As I have pointed out elsewhere, in its original meaning, Nirvana really does just mean snuffing out life like a candle by unweaving the threads of the personality so that it cannot be reborn. That is, this is a cop-out. By opting out, it leaves our world in the hands of the Devas and does not dare to challenge the system of oppression that they tyrannically claim is a divine order. In this sense, Buddhism is also a religion fundamentally shaped by the close encounter phenomenon, albeit as a nihilistic reaction to the suffering that the UFO pilots, pretending to be gods create for human beings and also for titans and for themselves. This is something that utterly escapes William Bramley in his otherwise brilliant book, The Gods of Eden, when he mistakenly classifies Buddhism as a maverick religion as compared to custodial, revealed religions, among which he atrociously lumps the teaching of Zarathustra, much more of a maverick than Gautama Buddha, together with the Abrahamic faiths, simply because it is militant in its rebellion against Devas. The Maya referred to in the passage above is Maya Daanava, an Asura known for his engineering prowess and ingenuity. There are even cases where Asuras make alliances with certain human kings as their designated viceroys and build a Vimana for their use in warfare against the Devas and the cities that they use as strongholds to maintain their control over the earth. Listen to this account of the Vimana that Maya Daanava, in a very Promethean fashion, built and gifted to King Shalva for an aerial assault on Lord Krishna's city of Dwaraka. It is from the 10th canto of the Bhagavad Purana and features peculiar phenomenological characteristics of contemporary UFOs, such as a single object seeming to become two or more, the Vimana appearing and disappearing, and the unsteady wobbling characteristic of flying saucers even when they are attempting to hover in a stationary position. The Vimana occupied by Shalva was very mysterious. It was so extraordinary that sometimes many aircraft would appear to be in the sky, and sometimes there were apparently none. Sometimes the Vimana was visible, and sometimes not visible, and the warriors of the Yadu dynasty were puzzled about the whereabouts of the peculiar aircraft. Sometimes they would see the Vimana on the ground, sometimes flying in the sky, sometimes resting on the peak of a hill, and sometimes flowing on the water. The wonderful Vimana flew in the sky like a whirling firebrand. It was not steady even for a moment. Another very curious descriptor in this text is that this unassailable vehicle was filled with darkness and could go anywhere. And of course, this description of the craft being filled with darkness, calls to mind dark matter or the energy of an artificial singularity inside of the UFO, which is what enables it to go anywhere. Some Vimana are so large that they are described as aerial cities, and even these are sometimes involved in warfare. So not all of the gods agreed that we should be punished for having sought knowledge and prevented from attaining the godlike immortality that is our birthright. Those who disagreed, and who are the ones referred to as Asuras in Sanskrit scriptures, were called giants by the Greeks. This term, gigantes, was used to translate references to these fallen angels, when the Bible was rendered into Greek. This brings us to another passage in Genesis where the humanoid character of the Elohim, in other words the Devas, and their leader Yahweh, Zeus, Indra, becomes clear. It is one of the most fascinating passages in the entire Bible. The key lines in Genesis 6:1-8 read as follows. When men began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the divine beings, Elohim, saw how beautiful the daughters of men were, and took wives from among those that pleased them. It was then, and later too, that the Nephilim appeared on earth. when the divine beings, Elohim, cohabited with the daughters of men who bore them offspring. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw how great was man's wickedness on earth, and how every plan devised by his mind was nothing but evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. The Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the men whom I have created, men together with beasts, creeping things, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. But Noah found favor with the Lord. What follows is the account of Noah's flood. A few things are immediately apparent here. First, the Elohim, who are obviously subject to sexual lust, are capable of mating with human women so as to spawn a hybrid race of heroes, or as the Greek translations of the Old Testament have it, a race of giants. The word Nephilim derives from the Hebrew root Nephil, meaning fall, so that it has been interpreted as the fallen ones. That is, the Elohim are gods who descended from the heavens or the stars to spawn the gigantic hybrids. This reading is the source of the term fallen angel, since the so-called angels of later Christian traditions are simply the Elohim or the gods themselves. Others have interpreted Nephilim to mean those who cause men to fall in battle. That is, violent conquerors or slayers, namely the giants or titans themselves. In Arabic, which is a Semitic sister language of Hebrew, Nephil means reactive, as in a reactionary. Throughout the last years of the 19th century and early years of the 20th century, there were repeatedly reports of the skeletal remains of a race of giants having been found. Newspaper records such as the Globe, London, and the New York Times reported on these finds. For example, one report in the New York Times of October 3, 1892 describes some human bones of enormous size, double the ordinary in fact, that were found in a burial mound in Castelnau, France, and acknowledged that these bones of a very tall race undoubtedly open the question of the giants of antiquity. As the Smithsonian Institute explored the North American continent, they found evidence for the tall white race of mound builders that the so-called Native Americans themselves have claimed preceded the Indians on the continent and had a much higher level of civilization than them, until the Indians massacred these whites. Already in the late 1800s, the Smithsonian was institutionally invested in promoting the narrative that no higher civilization than that of the American Indians had ever been present in North America, and they suppressed or secreted away finds of giant skeletons, which in some cases had crania that measured from 22 to 24 inches from base to crown, suggesting more than twice the normal human brain size. Giant skulls were also found in large numbers in Boskop, South Africa. These have been extensively studied, but the paleontological and anthropological reconstruction of the Boskop Man has been largely suppressed by the scientific establishment by being given the silent treatment, at least with regard to the mainstream media dissemination of this information. Paleontologists and anthropologists have known about the Boskop Man since the 1920s, but an interest in promoting the Darwinian narrative of evolution motivated marginalization of the studies of these skeletal remains. The problem, from the perspective of Darwinian orthodoxy, is that Boskop Man's skeletal remains are indistinguishable from that of a modern human, except for his skull, which exemplifies a stage of evolution as far into the future beyond Homo sapiens as Homo sapiens is beyond Homo erectus, namely at least 500,000 years. Based on the shape of its giant skull, Boskop Man's brain was 1750 cubic centimeters, or about 30% larger than that of Homo sapiens, 1350 cubic centimeters. But the prefrontal cortex of this brain may have been as much as 53% larger than ours. By comparison, the brain of Homo sapiens is only about 25% larger than that of Homo erectus. Recall that Homo erectus was much more primitive than Neanderthals and Denisovans, who are by comparison close cousins with whom Cro-magnon interbred. Some anomalously oversized Neanderthal skulls might be evidence that Neanderthals interbred with Boskops, in which case we have to wonder whether Cro-magnons did as well. The Boskop remains found thus far date from 30,000 to 10,000 years before the present. In other words, from the Atlantean epoch of the Nephilim, preceding and immediately following the flood. The larger, more evolved, brain case of these people also gave them very strange faces. Whereas the face of an average European adult extends over 1/3 of the person's cranial size, the Boskop's face only extended over 1/5 of his cranium. In other words, they had childlike faces, displaying a greater degree of neoteny than modern human. As we noted in Chapter 4, with reference to the time travel theory of UFOs proposed by Michael P. Masters, who is after all an anthropologist, adult morphological neoteny increases over the course of evolutionary history. The Boskop's nose, cheek, and jawbones are all childlike as compared to ours, just as ours are more childlike compared to those of more primitive hominids, and also as much flatter than our faces as our faces are from the protruding features of Homo erectus. Here is what mainstream naturalist Lauren Isley had to say about this. "There's just one thing we haven't quite dared to mention. It's this, and you won't believe it. It's all happened already. Back there in the past, 10,000 years ago, the man of the future with the big brain, the small teeth, his brain was bigger than your brain. His face was straight and small, almost a child's face. When the skull is studied in projection and ratios computed, we find that these folk have the amazing cranium to face ratio of almost 5:1. In Europeans, it is about 3:1. This figure is a marked indication of the degree to which the face size has been modernized undercoats and subordinated to brain growth. It is a face that would lend reality to the fantastic tales of our childhood. There is a hint of Wells' time machine folk in it, those pathetic childlike people whom Wells pictures as haunting Earth's autumnal cities in the far future of a dying planet. Yet this skull has not been spirited back to us through future eras by a time machine. It is a thing, instead, of the millennial past. It is a caricature of modern man, not by reason of its primitiveness, but startlingly because of a modernity outstretching its own. It constitutes, in fact, a mysterious prophecy and warning. For at the very moment in which students of humanity have been sketching their concept of the man of the future, that being has already come and lived and passed away. Such an establishment naturalist can only tell the truth to just as quickly deny it. Why not spirit it back to us through future eras by a time machine, undercoats, in the sense that the prehistoric Boskop Man remains really do represent a future stage in human evolution? I predict that if or when genetic material is recovered from Boskops, undercoats, and a comparative genomic analysis is carried out, it will be found that Boskops are further evolved Nordics, who engendered the Nordic/Aryan race in the first place by breeding with Cro-magnons. Yes, a kind of time loop set up by the time-traveling master race. An analytical reconstruction of the likely level of intelligence of this man of the future, undercoats, and a speculative model of his cognitive differences from us only offers more evidence for this controversial interpretation of the finds. Based on a correlation between cranial size and IQ, the IQ of the average Boskop would be 149. Which is genius level as compared to modern man. Accounting for the typical range of variance, this means that the 20% or 1/5 of them at the upper end of the spectrum would have IQs over 180. These calculations are based on the overall brain size differential, but it may be the case that it is the difference in size between their prefrontal cortex and ours that really ought to be the basis for such a projection, since this cortex is responsible for higher cognitive functioning. In that case, the average Boskop would have an IQ over 200 with their brightest individuals around 250. It has been speculated that their greater cognitive function would also have included highly branching brain paths that afforded them a continuous living memory of their past, as compared to our fragmentary and dim recollections. Their perceptual acuity and the range of sensory impressions that they could register simultaneously would have been far greater than ours, registering details of the conversations of everyone that had been heard during a walk along the street, together with an accurately formed memory of the music playing and all of the details of painted murals on walls and so forth. One wonders in this context whether the austerity of megalithic Atlantean architecture had something to do with an attempt to avoid sensory overload. They would have been capable of drawing very fine distinctions lost on most of us. More importantly, but relatedly, Boskop brains could have thought much further ahead with much greater clarity than we can. This anticipation of future moves and their numerous possible consequences and a mapping out of potential branching futures might actually have been rather crippling to action. They might have been excessively internal and self-reflective, undergoes, as Gary Lynch and Richard Granger speculate. With their perhaps astonishing insights, they have become a species of dreamers, undergoes. This sounds an awful lot like Joe McMonigal's description of the tall white people on Mars. As you may recall from chapter 5, he said that they were very philosophically minded, that their minds worked differently from ours, and they looked like they had gone through several more stages of human evolution. Though he was targeted to describe Mars millions of years in the past, he kept getting the impression that he was seeing the future of man, albeit one step removed from our reality, as if on a different timeline or subject to temporal revision. In any case, let us return to the giants of the Bible. What is clear is that some among the Elohim rebelled against the Lord by spawning an earthly civilization that was superhuman and, from the Lord's perspective, preoccupied with wicked and evil deeds. In fact, the Lord finds the godlike empowerment of mankind on the earth so offensive that he regrets, undergoes, the entire creation and decides to wipe it clean with the deluge that Noah is chosen to survive. What kind of God, undergoes, makes a mistake like this? Certainly not one who is omniscient and omnipotent. Something seems to be missing here. In only a few lines, the Bible tells us that the Lord has suddenly decided to wipe out the entirety of creation. What are these evil acts on the part of the rebel gods or fallen angels and their titanic offspring that have supposedly consumed humanity and that constitute a defiance of divine laws? Should not more have been said about them, especially given the fact that it is clearly stated that they began to take place after gods came down and interbred with humans? Well, as it turns out, more was said, but it was excised from the Bible as many other parts of it were over time. The text is known as the Book of Enoch. This is the same Enoch referred to in Genesis 5:21-24. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he begot Methuselah. After the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years, and he begot sons and daughters. All the days of Enoch came to 365 years. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more, for God took him. What this mysterious passage means is made clear in the Book of Enoch, where this prophet is taken up and away into the heavens in one of the chariots of the Elohim, and is shown apocalyptic scenes of the future judgment of the world. The Book of Enoch details the rise of a hybrid civilization of demigods on the earth. It is made clear that the gods who breed with mortal women are an army of angels who revolt against the Lord and attempt to enlighten humans by teaching them all kinds of arts and sciences. This especially improves the lot of women, whose innate physical superiority to men is cultivated to turn them into powerful sorceresses, and who are taught both method of birth control and of abortion, that they can take pleasure in sex as they wish and with whom they wish. It is probably with a view to this antediluvian liberation of women that the Bible specifically targets female practice of the occult arts in that famous injunction in Exodus 22:17 that was used by those in Europe and America who burned witches at the stake for centuries. Thou shalt not suffer a sorceress to live. There is a war between the hybrid human civilization that the rebel angels spawn and the army of the Lord, and these giants lose. Their civilization is wiped out in a worldwide deluge, and the fallen angels themselves are bound to remain incarcerated beneath the earth. Later in European history, John Milton develops this theme of war between God and the rebel leader Lucifer in Paradise Lost. One mention of war amongst the gods in the Bible itself is in Revelation 12:7-9. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him.